Okay, so we're on page 7 at the bottom of the page. This is paragraph 9 in chapter 2 of the laws of Teshuva, the Rambam.
What page? Page 1?
Page 7. In paragraph 9 at the bottom of the page. I have to give just a little background, which I'm taking from chapter 1, just to bring in here to give you the background. And it'll clarify something we said yesterday, which I didn't stop on to add. I made a statement yesterday, which he makes in a later chapter, which is, a person does tshuva. Tshuva is like a wall standing in the way of punishment. A person who does tshuva cannot be punished. It's over. Okay. But in chapter 1, Maimonides says, he's quoting a Mishnah in Masechta Yuma, that there are 4 categories of transgressions. One category is a simple positive commandment, put on tefillin, give charity. If a person violates one of those and does tshuva, he's forgiven and cleansed on the spot. The atonement is complete on the spot. If it's a simple negative prohibition, no cheeseburgers, and so forth and so on, then he does tshuva and he goes through Yom Kippur and he's cleansed and the atonement is finished. If it's a negative commandment that carries a serious penalty, like the death penalty, or koros, being cut off from God, something like that, then it requires tshuva, Yom Kippur, and suffering. And if it's a serious prohibition and there's a desecration of God's name, then it requires tshuva and Yom Kippur and suffering and death. Death ends the story. So now, let's see how we can put together that statement I just made for you with the other one that I made for you. I said that tshuva is a wall against punishment. If he does tshuva, no punishment will apply, not in this world and not in the next world. And now we're being told, let's say, for murder or for some other, or violating Shabbos, or that since it's so serious a transgression, you need tshuva and Yom Kippur and suffering to cleanse him of the transgression. Why wasn't tshuva enough? Why wasn't tshuva the wall against punishment, which now we're being told he will have to suffer? And the answer, now, I believe it, but I'm not just opining it. It seems to be obviously the truth. This is the answer. That although there will be suffering, it's not punishment. The suffering is not punishment. It's sort of like you tell someone this container of clear liquid on the counter, don't touch it. Okay, if he's 11, what's he going to do when you walk out of the room? He's going to stick his hand in it, right? Now it's an acid, and his hand gets burned. Now in the treatment for the acid burn, there are painful procedures. Are those painful procedures punishment for what he did? Maybe not. He's got an acid burn. It has to be healed. So the suffering that comes after tshuva isn't punishment for the crime, it's a cleansing of the consequences of the crime. The crime did something to the person. It's changed his character, changed his inner spiritual structure, and he needs a process which is going to rectify that. And sometimes the process is a painful process. But it's not punishment. So now, the Rambam says here, tshuva and Yom Kippur only atone. What does atone mean? It means tshuva is what stops punishment, and Yom Kippur is what then, for certain category of transgressions, finishes the atonement process so that nothing else has to be done to even purify him or rectify his own inner self-damage. In other words, the entire story's over. The whole process of rectification is over, right? But not always. Tshuva and Kippur only atone for sins between man and God. For example, a person who ate forbidden food, or engaged in forbidden sexual relations, and the like. However, sins between man and man, for example, someone who injures a colleague, curses a colleague, steals from him, or the like, will never be forgiven until he gives his colleague what he owes him and appeases him. So what about rectifying the damage to the other person? So he says that Teshuva may be what prevents punishment, but sometimes Yom Kippur is required to cleanse the person and rectify the damage he did to himself. All that is fine if it's a sin between man and God. But a sin between man and man, Teshuva, which does do the job of preventing punishment, and Yom Kippur don't suffice to cleanse him of the consequences of what he did. That requires breaking it up to the person who was injured. Now, I know I've said it twice already, but let's just register what's being said. This idea of making it up to the person who's been injured is not part of the Teshuva. He says he did Teshuva. He completed doing the Teshuva. The Teshuva mitzvah Teshuva is done. And still he doesn't get atonement until he makes it up to the other person. So making it up to the other person is part of the cleansing process. It's not part of the Teshuva action. Not part of the mitzvah of Teshuva.
So they're different.
They are different.
Cleansing, Teshuva.
That's right. Exactly right. Just like in chapter 1, where you have, let's say, a person committed murder. So he's got to do Teshuva and go through Yom Kippur, and there will be suffering. But Teshuva stops all punishment. So we said Yom Kippur and suffering is the cleansing, correcting process. Here he's telling you that a sin for which usually Teshuva and Yom Kippur suffice, let's say eating a cheeseburger. When it comes to stealing, which legally is on the same par, it's a simple prohibition. For stealing, it won't work. The Teshuva is done, the Teshuva stops punishment, but the cleansing process requires also making it up to the person who was hurt. That's an additional to the cleansing process. And he puts in that he has to give him what he stole, pay for what he damaged, and appease him, which means ask his forgiveness. All of that is part of the cleansing process. Now, I don't think this is exactly obvious. Other Meforshim would put appeasing the person who's injured or hurting things to the person who's injured into the Teshuva mitzvah. They would make it part of the Teshuva mitzvah. Rambam is clearly separating it out into two things. And I'll tell you how they would do it, and I'm not sure why the Rambam resists this logic. Probably because of the way in which he reads the verses, but he resists this logic. Let's imagine somebody steals something. Reuven steals Shimon's book. Now that book is on Reuven's bookshelf in a paper cover. Okay, so it shouldn't be identified. And now Reuven says, I stole his book. Terrible. What a terrible thing to do. Oh, I feel terrible. I wish I hadn't stolen it. That was a nasty thing to do. He goes to Shimon and says, I stole your book. I'm really sorry. I wish I hadn't done it. I'll never steal again. Do you forgive me? Wouldn't we say, Reuven, wait a second. Shimon's book is still on your shelf. How about giving him back the book? No, you're not giving him back the book. You say, I wish I hadn't taken it, but you're holding on to it still? Isn't that a little odd? Like, what's your state of mind exactly, Reuven? Right? So a person could say that if he doesn't rectify the damage that he did to the other person, his regret isn't sincere.
The Teshuva is less effective.
Well, not only less effective, but you could hear a person say, and therefore he hasn't really done Teshuva. If he says, I promise I'll never steal again, what? Except for Shimon's book, which I have on my shelf, that one I'm keeping, right? That's also ridiculous. So I could hear someone say, of course, rectifying the damage that you did is required by really regretting what you did and really resolving not to do that sort of thing again. And it really ought to be part of Teshuva. That logic is a difficulty for the Rambam. I didn't see anybody ask it, but I think I saw other commentaries who say that it is part of the Teshuva. The Rambam is quite clear, his words are quite clear, that Teshuva does not require that. Now, it sounds like, well, I'm not going to speculate. I'm just pointing out that that's the way the Rambam looks at it. But this idea of the interpersonal needing this kind of rectification, everybody agrees to that. The only question is whether it's considered part of the mitzvah or an accompaniment to the mitzvah to complete the cleansing process. Okay? And he says he says, it must be emphasized that even if a person restores the money that he owes, he must appease him and ask him to forgive him. Even if a person only upset a colleague by saying certain things, his words hurt him. It didn't cost him any money. He must appease him and approach him repeatedly until he forgives him. Now, sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes in the relationship between the two people, it doesn't go easily. If his colleague does not desire to forgive him, he should bring a group of 3 of his friends, that is to say the colleague's friends, and approach him with them and request forgiveness. So he goes to, Reuven did something bad to Shimon, and he has to ask Shimon forgiveness. Goes to Shimon, and Shimon says no. The next thing Reuven does is he gathers 3 of Shimon's friends, and in front of 3 of Shimon's friends, he says, I wronged him, I did something terrible to him, and I request forgiveness. If the wrong party is not appeased, so Shimon is still not willing, he should repeat the procedure a second and third time, which means he has already asked for forgiveness 4 times. If he still does not want to forgive him, he may let him alone and need not pursue the matter further. After once asking him in private and 3 times in front of 3 friends, after that's been done, the person who committed the crime is no longer required to do anything else. On the contrary, the person who refuses to grant forgiveness is the one who's considered as the sinner. At this point, Shimon, who was the original victim, now he becomes a transgressor. At this point, he's required to give forgiveness. Now, as I told you last time in another context, the victim needs to be convinced of the sincerity of the transgressor. I think that's a big part of the idea of bringing 3 friends. If the transgressor is going to admit it in front of his 3 friends and ask for forgiveness, then he's damaging his own reputation. He's doing something which people will look down on him, just like confessing in public does. And that being the case, that should be a good reason to think that he really means it. But the above does not apply if the wronged party was one's teacher. In that case, a person should continue seeking forgiveness even 1,000 times until he forgives him. And I think I know of 2 things going on here. There could be many more things that I don't know. One is that wronging your teacher is a much more serious crime. And the teacher who's supposed to forgive has to take into account that the crime is a much more serious crime. And I'll give you an example. A person owes honor to various people. He owes honor to his parents, and he owes honor to his teacher. Obviously, he owes honor to God, he owes honor to the Torah. There is a Gemara that says that the honor that you owe for your teacher is equivalent to the honor that you owe for God. If I'm not mistaken, it's the Taz in the Shulchan Aruch who says, is that really, literally true? How could you compare your honor for any flesh and blood person to the honor that you have to have for God?
Sometimes it's easier.
Sorry, say again?
Sometimes it's easier to honor a human or to fear a human more than God. Like we wouldn't steal something in front of a human, but sometimes we'll steal something when no one's home.
That's because you don't take your being before God seriously.
Yeah.
Right? If you were in the middle of prophecy, you wouldn't do it.
No.
Right? Or the Shekhinah were manifest. But if I'm not mistaken, the way the Taz explains it is this. Okay, I'm required to show honor for God. How do I do that? Say, well, now I'm being slightly silly. If God would walk into the room, I would stand up to show honor. But he doesn't walk into the room. So how do you show honor for God? Okay, there's a very interesting verse which says, Mikdashi tiro, in fact it says it twice. You should have awe for the temple, the tabernacle. So the Gemara says, a Jew should have awe for a building? A building? Come on, that's not Judaism. What are you talking about? No, it means you should have awe for the one whose presence is manifest in the building, meaning for God. Fine, that's what the Gemara explains. But you have to ask yourself, why didn't the Torah tell me to have awe for the one whose presence is manifest in the building? Why did it say the place I have to have awe for? And secondly, as a matter of fact, there's another verse which says, Hashem Elokecha Tira, you have to have awe for Hashem. So it's already said that you have to have awe for Hashem. So the answer again is this: how do I show awe for Hashem? How do I express it? Well, there's a place that's designated as the locus of His presence. Treat that with awe, because it's related to Him, because it's connected to Him. Treat it with awe. Don't treat it like any other building. And in that way, you show awe for Hashem, whose presence is manifest there. It's a little bit. I'll give you another analogy. Another thing. Let's suppose you have a king, and in every city in his kingdom, and there's a certain place where a statue to him is erected. Honor of the king, right? If someone treats that statue with disrespect, he's disrespecting the king, because that statue represents the king to the people. So now, when the Taz says, the honor that you have for your teacher of Torah, we're talking about teacher of Torah here, should be equal to the honor that you have for Hashem, one way to explain it is, how are you going to show honor for Hashem? How do you do that? Well, one way you do that is you show honor for the teacher who's teaching you God's Torah. That's the way in which you show honor for God. That way it's equal, because that's how you carry it out. That's how you express it. Okay, so now, if someone wrongs his teacher, the teacher has to think, well, let's see, it wasn't nice, and it did hurt me, and it did cost me, and he really owes it to me. Yeah, but he also owes it to Hashem, because the way he treats me is the way he's treating Hashem. That has to be repented for. That has to be regretted. That has to be resolved as something which he's not going to do in the future. So when he asks his teacher to forgive him, the teacher has to take into account the whole context. And he may very well say, okay, I know he feels bad about what he did to me, but he doesn't appreciate the enormity of what he did. He doesn't appreciate the consequences, the ramifications, and therefore he hasn't yet asked forgiveness for the actual crime that he committed. And therefore I'm not going to forgive him. So the teacher is credited with the judgment to be able to say whether the teshuva that he's done is applied to the crime as a whole, and that's why 3 isn't enough times. It may very well be that he hasn't reached that level yet. That's why I told you the story that happened to me in Boston.
What happened in Boston?
The others all hear it? No? Oh, so I'll tell you that. This was in the 70s when I was living there. A guy came up to me in Elul, and he said, the Boston Rebbe is not getting atonement on Yom Kippur this year. And I said, really? Why not? He said, because I did something against him, and I went to him and I asked him for forgiveness, and he refused to forgive me. I said, I don't believe that. I was a chassid of the Rebbe for 47 years, though that was much earlier then, but still, I thought I knew my Rebbe well. I said, he would never die. He would never say he wouldn't forgive someone. Well, that's what he told me. So I didn't believe him. And I went to the Rebbe to ask him. The Rebbe said, yeah, I told him that I don't forgive him. I said, why? He said, because he didn't mean it. Then I thought to myself, dope! If he's going around and telling people the Boston Rebbe is not going to have atonement this year in Yom Kippur, how sincere was he? Not really. Right? I could have figured that out myself if I had thought about it more carefully. Right? He certainly wasn't sincere. So that's an example of where a Rebbe can say, I make the judgment whether you're sincere or not, which means I'm requiring you to do more spiritual work before you end your contact with this event. And that guy failed the test. Okay, that's what it says here. Now, paragraph 10 at the bottom of 8. It is forbidden for a person to be cruel and refuse to be appeased. This is what we said above, that he said that after 3 times, the one who refuses becomes the criminal, but now he's explaining where that comes from. Rather, he should be easily pacified and hard to anger. And the Chazal here say, with respect to anger and pacification, are four character types of people. There are people who are like stone. It's hard to get them angry, but once they're angry, it's hard to pacify them. They have a big inertia, emotional inertia. It's hard to change them. So it's good that it's hard to get them angry. That's good. But it's not so good that it's hard to pacify them. And there are people who it's easy to anger, but it's easy to pacify. Well, it's not nice to be often angry, but if you can be easily pacified, that's a kind of compensation. There are people who get angry and they stay angry forever. You know nations like that. You know cultures like that. You know where clans have wars and they never get over the enmity. In fact, those cultures look at the West and they think the people in the West are crazy. Just think of the Second World War. The Allies fought against Germany and Japan, America in particular. It was like 2 million American soldiers were killed. Instantly, at the end of the war, America and Germany and Japan became allies against Russia. What? You should hate each other for 1,000 years. You're killing each other's people. Millions of people died. No. New geopolitical constellation, new threat, and all of a sudden they become allies. They can't even imagine that. So, Rambam says, it's forbidden for a person. Now, the ideal is to be hard to anger. Okay, people aren't angels, but it should be hard. You should have a big inertia against getting angry. And when the person tries to pacify you, it should be very easy to pacify. That's what a person should be. Back to 10. When the person who wronged him asks for forgiveness, he should forgive him with a complete heart and a willing spirit. Even if he aggravated and wronged him severely, he should not seek revenge or bear a grudge. The Gemara distinguishes between seeking revenge and bearing a grudge this way. I say to my friend, I need a shovel. My shovel is broken. Can I borrow your shovel? And he says, you? Borrow my shovel? No, you can't borrow my shovel. But next week he comes to me and says, could I borrow your shovel? I say to him, are you kidding? I just asked you last week to borrow your shovel. He said, no, he's like me now to lend you a shovel, right?
He doesn't have one.
Well, of course he does now, right? Otherwise he wouldn't come to ask him, right? He does now. And so that, if he does that, that's taking revenge. You didn't give me, I'm not giving you. That's forbidden. That's forbidden. Bear grudges, where the second one comes and says, can I borrow your shovel? He says, listen, I'm not like you. You said no. I'm saying yes. No, you're a bum. You're really a bum. I'm not like you.
That's worse than the first one.
No, it isn't,
really?
It isn't worse, but that's called how do you put it here? Yeah. That's bearing a grudge. So we're forbidden to do both of those. We have to put the past in the past and say, he needs my help, and I should give it to him openly and willingly. That would be to forgive him for what he did. Now, don't make a mistake. These rules like this, there are many such rules, do not require you to be a victim. They do not require you to be a victim. If he borrowed your shovel once and broke it, you don't have to lend him another shovel. If someone threatens you, you don't have to give. If he owes you money, you don't have to give up on the money. When you go to sleep at night, those who say the paragraph says, I forgive everybody, all the wrongs they've done for me, and in some texts they had little parentheses, except money that they owes me I can collect in court, and that I can go after. So you don't have to make yourself into a victim. And it's more than that. If he owes you money in court and you give up on it, then maybe he'll suffer for that, because he owes the money. He has money that's not his. He's succeeding in a crime. By taking him to court and getting your money back, you're preventing him from committing a crime. That's good for him. That's good for him. You benefit him by doing that. So we're not talking about being a victim, but we're talking about taking revenge or bearing grudge for past actions that we're not allowed to do. Now he says at the top of page 9, this is the path of the seed of Israel and their upright spirit. That's the way the Jews behave. In contrast, in the non-Jewish world, this is not considered to be appropriate behavior. It's certainly not regular behavior. Rather, their wrath is preserved forever. Similarly, because the Givenites did not forgive, refused to be appeased, that's what happens follows. The Givenites are not among the children of Israel because this is a cultural, spiritual characteristic of the Jewish people that they are ready to forgive. Yeah? Okay.
We don't forgive Amalek, right?
So it's very, very tricky. And this, since you're asking, I don't know, a lot of people are not aware of this. In the chapter 6 of the laws of kings and their wars, which is towards the end of the Rambam's Mishneh Torah, he describes what it means to go to war. And he says, you do not go to war with any person, Adam ba'olam, unless you first offer him peace. And he specifies explicitly the 7 nations who are inhabitants of the land of Israel and Amalek. You do not go to war unless you offer them peace. If they accept peace on the terms that the Torah dictates, you don't kill anybody. You don't kill anybody. If they don't, then there's a war. There are various kind of outcomes to the war. But you offer peace to everyone. So, and in fact, there were Amalekite converts to Israel. So the idea of, I don't know if it's called forgiving or not, but the idea that we have an eternal war against them is only if they opt not to accept our peace terms. Some people don't know that. Okay, now, here's an example of something I mentioned a couple of times a few days ago. If a person wronged a colleague and the latter died before he could ask him for forgiveness, now what? So remember I told you the rule. There are rules in Teshuva and how to do the mitzvah of Teshuva, but suppose one of the rules becomes impossible to do. So if that's the case, then you do what you can, and that's enough. We don't say, well, look, there are 6 requirements, and number 4 became impossible, so you just lose out and you can't do the mitzvah. We don't say that. If you do all of the mitzvah that you're able to do, then you get credit for doing the mitzvah. This is a mitzvah which is not dependent upon every part being present. It's a mitzvah that tolerates subdivision. So here's what he should do. He should take 10 people and say the following while they're standing before the colleague's grave. Okay, so Reuven wronged Shimon, and he didn't ask Shimon for forgiveness, and Shimon died. Now Reuven takes 10 people and goes to Shimon's grave. Now watch very carefully what's said here. Don't let your imagination take you away. I've sinned against God, the Lord of Israel, and against this person by doing the following to him. What's missing that you might have thought should be here? Again, what was the problem? The problem is Reuven wronged Shimon. He's supposed to ask him for forgiveness, and he didn't do that. Now Shimon died. Now he takes 10 people and goes to the grave. What would you expect him to say? Say, yeah, please, Shimon, forgive me. Why is he going to his grave? Hello, Shimon, hello, forgive me. No, it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. You're not going to the grave to communicate with Shimon and ask him for after death forgiveness. You are going before the grave and saying to the 10 people, I sinned against him and I did this and this, and I'm sorry that I did it. I wish I hadn't done it. And that's instead of asking him for forgiveness, because you can't ask him for forgiveness because he's not there. So that's what you do. And then, all right, so then you couldn't ask him for forgiveness, so you do this instead. This is what you can do. So we say, oh yeah, but you didn't ask him for forgiveness. True, but this is what you can do. If you do this, it's enough. And the Teshuva is accepted. And finally, if you owe him money, okay, Reuben stole money from Shimon, and Shimon has disappeared. Even Google Maps can't find him. Ego, even Waze can't find him. It's just lost contact, lost touch. There was a guy became famous in certain ways, and I wanted to look him up. There's nothing on the internet about his childhood. Nothing. Zero. I was really surprised. I thought that the internet was omniscient. I thought it knew everything. No, we couldn't find a single reference. It started off after college, I graduated from college. And all after that, it's all there, but before that, it's not there. So what should he do? Well, he's unaware of the identity of his heirs. Now, the first thing he's do is find out if he's alive. And if he's not alive, find out who inherited him and go to them and give them the money. If he doesn't have that, then he should place the sum in the hands of the court and confess. The court is a public place. The court is a place where you hear things. People come and tell you stories about what happened. Maybe the court will be able to trace him and hand the money over to him. But if not, he did what he needs to do. Because it's all that's left to do. He did everything that he could do, and that's enough. And that satisfied the requirement of Teshuva. There's a famous story about the Chafetz Chaim. For a certain period of time, the Chafetz Chaim had a store, which actually his wife ran. And at the end of the day, they calculated what was sold and how much money they had, and they had extra money. Which means somebody didn't get his change. But now, it's all cash, and there's no way for anyone to prove that he was the one who was shortchanged. Even if someone will come and say so, there's no reason to believe him necessarily, and if he wasn't and somebody else was, then it's going to go to the wrong person. What to do? Here's what he did. He dug a well and made its use free to the whole village. Whoever they shortchanged, he will use the free water, and he'll have value from that water, which will cover and go beyond the money that he was shortchanged. So he managed to make it to work, that even though he doesn't know who did it, he's making sure that he's going to pay him back. But that's a rare case where you can actually do that. The halacha is go give it to the court, and at that point, the Kodesh Baruch Hu will arrange that the right person should get it if he should get it, if not, and the person who stole the money has done what he can. So that's the general rule over here. Are we together so far? Yeah.
Reuben admitted to Shimon's rape.
No, it's a different case. Still a different case. Okay, now comes chapter 3. Chapter 3 is full of very interesting and sometimes controversial ideas. Rambam starts with a statement. Each and every person has merits and sins. Wow. That means no one's record is perfect. No one. Each and every person, Rambam is very specific. I write, note this, number one. And actually, it's based on a verse, a famous verse. And just for the record, I will quote it to you correctly because when it's quoted, almost always a word is left out. The verse is, Ein Adam Sadik Ba'aretz Asher Yas Tov Lo Yechta. There's no person, people leave out the word Adam. There's no person righteous in the world who will do good and not fail. Yechtas can mean sin or fail. No one makes it through without failing. So that's, if you take the verse straightforwardly, and yes, we know there's a Gemara in Shabbos, and there's the four who didn't, and there's a Tosfos, there's a Marsha, there's a Yeshua. Okay, that's for aficionados. We know all about that. But the point is, the Rambam is saying that everyone has merits and sins. Now, as I point out in the parenthesis here, but that doesn't preclude a person from leaving the world with a perfect record. Even though everyone has failures on his record, he can leave the world with a perfect record because Teshuva enables you to rectify the failure. That's one of the great features of Teshuva. That even though people are put in a world where there's going to be failure, that doesn't mean that you have to be a failure. You did something which was a failing, but you can take it off your record. So that you can leave the world perfect, even though you did something wrong. That's one of the great consequences of there being a mitzvah of Teshuva. Now, the Rambam says, a person whose merits exceed his sins is termed righteous. tzaddik. I have to tell you, the word tzaddik and the correlative word Russia, which we translated as evil, have at least 5 definitions, maybe more. So when the Rambam says that he's termed righteous in this context, it means for certain purposes in this context. It doesn't mean everywhere you see the word tzaddik, you can say, it means a majority of his actions. His majority is good. There are much higher standards in other contexts. Person whose merits exceed his sins. This translation here is very good. Not his actions. His merits exceed his sins. We'll see that it's quite subtle. A person whose sins exceed his merits is termed wicked. If his sins and merits are equal, he's called a Beinoni, which means in between. The same applies to an entire country. If the merits of all its inhabitants exceed their sins, it is termed righteous. If their sins are greater, it's termed wicked. The same applies to the entire world. Now, believe it or not, with such a simple statement, there's an ambiguity here. Let's suppose I have 10 people. And let's suppose that each person has 10 actions. And we're talking about majority. So now, that means there are 10 people with 10 actions. There are 100 actions altogether. We're talking about designating the group as righteous or wicked. And we're talking about the majority of the group. There are 2 different ways to do it. One way to do it is to simply say the output of the group as a whole is 100 actions. Count up the total number of actions. There are 51 good actions and 49 bad actions, then it's righteous. Vice versa, it's wicked. That's one way to do it. But here's another way to do it. Take a look at each person and see for each person what's the majority. And if this person is majority is good, you call him righteous. And that person's majority good, is righteous. That person is majority bad, so he's wicked. Do it person by person. And then take the majority of people. If the majority of people are righteous, then the total, some group is righteous. Rather than the majority of actions. Where will this make a difference? In what kind of case will it make a difference? Let's suppose that the people who are good are really good. No, let's take it the other way. Let's take the people who are good are just barely good. There are 6 there that have 6 good actions each. And there are 4 there who have 10 bad actions. So now if I count up people, 6 are majority good, so there are 6 righteous and 4 wicked. So the majority of people are good. I count up the actions, the 6 who are good each have 6 good actions and 4 bad actions. That's 24. The 4 who are bad have 10 bad actions each. It's 40. It's 64 bad actions. So if I count people, the group is going to be righteous. And if I count actions, it's going to be wicked. It means that the excess of actions, above and beyond just did you make it over the middle line, have extra weight. In this case that I'm describing, the good ones are barely good, and the bad ones are really, really bad. So the complexion of the whole becomes bad. That's what the Rambam says. That's his criterion. You don't do it by the majority of righteous people versus wicked people. You do it by the majority of total actions. The total actions create the complexion of the whole. And if it's 64 bad actions to 36 good actions, then the complexion of the whole is bad. Okay, now, page 10. Here comes the really surprising law, paragraph 2 on page 10. If a person's sins exceed his merits, he will immediately die because of his wickedness. Yeah. That sounds surprising, hey? And he quotes a verse. Similarly, a country whose sins are great, will immediately be obliterated. Another verse. According to the whole world as well, the sins are greater than their merits, they would immediately be destroyed, as it says. Wow. Let's see. If a person is just over the 50-50 line, he's going to die right away. Doesn't it seem that we're all aware of people who seem to violate that rule? You know, there's some really nasty people in the world. And in fact, the Ravid, who's one of the Rambam's chief critics, disagrees with this vociferously. And by the way, for you and for the recording, I just want to report a piece of fact which may settle a doubt in your mind. When you read, you'll get to the point where you study the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, and you'll read the comments of the Ravid. The Ravid sounds to be very strongly dismissive or critical of the Rambam. And the natural thought is, Maimonides? He's criticizing Maimonides like that? Just waving him out of the room? No, that's not right. He misunderstood the Gemara, and so forth and so on. How could he do that? Well, the answer is that the Ravid was older than the Rambam. Well, he wrote a commentary on the Rambam, so he must be younger later. No, he was older. The Rambam was young, up and coming, and his manuscripts were being circulated. And the Ravid was the head of the yeshiva, said, okay, there's this new up and coming, let's see what he's writing, let's see whether it's right or wrong, see whether it's good or bad. He had no reason to think he was criticizing Maimonides, the Rambam. He was just Moses ben Maimon who was writing things. Right? At any rate, here we feel that it's very hard to understand what the Rambam is saying because we think we all are aware of counterexamples to this rule. So the next words in the Rambam give the key to the answer, and we'll expand on this tomorrow in Hashem in much greater detail. This reckoning is not calculated, I wouldn't put in the word only, on the basis of, now, I should have changed the translation here, number of good actions and bad actions. Here you could write in and change it. I should have changed it. You're not counting up his actions. How many good actions does he have? How many bad actions does he have? That's not how you weigh up his merits and his sins. But takes into account their magnitude. Not every action has the same significance, value, impact as every other action. Some are fairly trivial and some are very serious. There are some good actions which outweigh many bad actions. And in contrast, there are bad actions which outweigh many good actions. In other words, a single good action may have many merits attached to it. That's why I wouldn't translate the way he translates it. And a single bad action may have many demerits attached to it. The actions are not of equal significance. When you think about it, that's really obvious, right? You know, if you steal somebody's stick of gum, that's not the same as putting him in a cell and torturing him for a week. They're both wrong, they're both forbidden, but obviously the one is much more serious than the other. So you can't just count up how many good actions he did and how many bad actions he did. So what do? It says, the weighing of sins and merits is carried out according to the wisdom of the knowing God. And I put in here, literally the one who knows the individual character of each person. He knows how to measure good actions against bad actions, which means the calculation can only be made by God. Does that answer the question we started with 3.5 minutes ago? Let's go back to the question. Maimonides says if it's a majority of bad, he dies immediately. And we say, we know lots of people who are majority of bad and don't die. And Maimonides say, you do? No, you don't. No, you don't. This majority is something which can only be weighed up by God, and you're not God. I hope that's not news to you. I hope that doesn't just push you into despair that you're not God. Only God can calculate the significance of the actions that a person performs. And so, no, you don't know counterexamples. And if you think you know counterexamples, you're guilty of overweening pride. You should have withheld judgment. You should realize that you can't examine something like this. There's a verse when God tells Samuel to go and anoint one of his sons as king, and God tells Samuel to go to Yishai, and tells him to anoint one of his sons king. And he says to Yishai, gather your sons together. For whatever reason, he calls in 6 of his sons. Doesn't call in David. And Samuel looks at the 6 of them. And the oldest, Samuel says, wow, he really looks wonderful. He really looks like he's worthy of being king. And God says to him, I'm disgusted with him. And God says, man looks with his eyes. Only Hashem sees into the heart. He said that to Samuel the prophet. Samuel is compared to Moses and Aaron. That's really quite a thing. So when we think, oh, I know counterexamples to this rule, Ahmadi says, no, you don't. Because you don't look into the heart. Well, we'll have to talk about what about the heart is relevant here and what kinds of mistakes people could make. But that's how the Rambam, this Kesef Mishnah says, that's the Rambam's answer to the Ravid's Kasha. You know, when you know this depends upon God's evaluation, and you realize that you can't make God's evaluation, then you understand why you can't say that you have counterexamples to this rule. Okay?
Right.
Yeah.